So after our last epic, we have a shorter one here today where we'll just kind of wrap up Chapter 9 and look at some attempts to or calls for reform within the congressional system, the legislature. Most Americans, of course, when presented with some of these options, or when asked about some of these options, most Americans will jump at them because the thought of reform, cleaning it up, draining the swamp, etc., sounds like a good move. But as I hope to show you looking at a couple of these, it's not as simple as just, going in there and hammering out some new rules. Now, there have been calls for, various options. There have been calls for term limits, campaign finance laws, all sorts of other things. Some have been done, like campaign finance reform. But we also talked about how, term limits have been prevented. But one thing, and it's something we'll talk more about here in a moment, the pork barrel legislation. Many people, of course, point to pork barrel spending and pork barrel politics as being one of the biggest issues. That Congress takes a lot of money and wastes a lot of money, that a lot of amendments and riders are pork barrel, and they aren't actually necessary for the legislation, and they just add it and make it cumbersome. They make things more difficult. We'll get back to pork here in a moment, but that's a topic we have to consider, or a reform that has to be considered. One thing that members of Congress absolutely love is the franking privilege. Members of Congress are allowed to send material through the mail free of charge, and they can do this by substituting their signature, which is known as a frank, rather than postage. Now, the idea originally was that this would guarantee that congressmen kept their districts informed. Basically, you wanted it to be to where a congressman communicating with his constituents in his home district, that there would be no financial barrier or financial deterrent. And so the idea is you're going to make it easy and free for members of Congress. But it has turned to where members are using the frank, or they did at one point, to send newsletters, questionnaires, etc. And so, they use the frank as a way to basically campaign, and it gives them an unfair advantage in an election because basically they have free ability to mail campaign stuff. The frank is basically a way to get a government subsidized contact with your constituents, with your district. Now, Congress has not made an effort to remove the frank altogether, but there have been limits put on the frank in an attempt to kind of cut down on people using it loosely or overusing it in order to help them win elections, for example. One issue that people have pointed out, Congress being exempt from the very laws that Congress passes and other laws. Some members of Congress have pointed out, though, that if they were subject to every law, that there is the chance that they would in some ways come under the control of the executive branch. Certain laws which have to be, obviously all laws have to be enforced by the executive branch to some regard. That's the executive branch's job. But for example, minimum wage laws, various other occupational laws, they argued that would actually put them at the mercy of the executive branch. So there have been efforts by Congress to make sure that when they write in the laws that there's an exemption written in for them. Most famously, in recent history, I guess I would argue, I shouldn't say famously, but one that obviously a lot of people noticed, the Affordable Care Act. For those of you familiar with it, this is old news for those of you unfamiliar. So in the Affordable Care Act, they said you could keep your insurance, but some insurance programs would be given a fine or a fee called a Cadillac tax, where basically if the program was too good, there was a penalty for you to keep it. And of course, that made premiums for those health insurance programs go up. From what I have read, I've tried to hunt it down, but obviously this is a little bit of conjecture because of HIPAA law. It's impossible to actually get the answer, but I've seen people argue that if you look at the exemptions when it comes to Cadillac taxes, they're very specific. And there's the argument that basically members of Congress exempted their own health care coverage, their own health care plans to make sure they avoided that. So that's an example from recent history that people have complained, oh, it's good enough for the rest of us, but not good enough for you. This law is so awesome, but magically you guys made yourselves exempt from it. There was an effort in 1995. Congress did pass a bill which obliges Congress to obey 11 different governmental laws relating to civil rights, occupational safety, fair labor standards, etc. The Bipartisan Congressional Accountability Act, which is what kind of set the stage for this, it basically has to tackle the major issue of you have to maintain separation of powers, right? So it would be not only unwise, but it would be unconstitutional to actually put Congress at the mercy of the executive branch on certain laws. So what they did is they created a system for Congress to actually have to comply to certain laws that are enforced by the federal government. They created the Independent Office of Compliance. So this has nothing to do with the executive branch. It's an independent compliance agency that basically has oversight over Congress. And there is a system, an employee grievance procedure, as it's called, to where if a member of a congressional staff feels like the rules are being violated, they can file a claim. And this is the system that makes the Congress now obey, for example, the Civil Rights Act, Equal Pay Act, Age Discrimination Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, Medicare Act, etc. So they did attempt to create a system or a way that makes the Congress comply with federal standards that are at the control of the executive branch without actually making them under the purview of the executive branch, which would then, like I said, potentially violate constitutional separation of powers. And now backing up for a moment, and this is the one that again comes up all the time: pork barrel spending and pork barrel politics being, the heart and soul of all of the problems, right? If you just got rid of that, if you got that out of the mix, they'd have to be honest, right? They'd have to be legitimate. They couldn't just bribe each other and cover things up with all sorts of spending and give all the people in their district a lollipop to make it all good. They complain that pork also again makes it almost impossible for a challenger to defeat an incumbent because you can always bring home the bacon, so to speak, for your district. Now, while obviously pork barrel spending is a problem, if you want to look at it, as your book said, pork barrel spending amounted to 2.5% of the budget every year from 1993 to 2005. By 2015, most people would say that pork spending, or spending that would qualify as pork, only counts for about 1% of the federal budget. Now, first of all, it's not a major aspect. Even if you cut out pork barrel spending, all right, so trim the budget by 1%, you still have a massive deficit. Even in good years, you still have a pretty sizable deficit. Our ratio of income to deficit, how underwater our budget is, exceeds 1%, exceeds 2, 3, it's more than that. So a 1% decrease in spending is not going to magically be the difference between deficit and a balanced budget or surplus budget. And as your book mentioned, and I've hinted at previously, you call it pork, but for a certain group of Americans, it's vital, or it's important, or it's why they sent that man to Capitol Hill. One man's trash is another man's treasure. One man's pork is another man's legislation. So some Americans, every time something comes around, it might seem wasteful to you, but there's a group of Americans who desperately wanted that, and they don't want to see their program go. And if they're going to give up theirs, you have to give up yours. There's also the fact that pork is the grease that keeps the machinery running. You cannot force a member of Congress to vote a certain way. You can't. You can't force them to vote. They freely vote. You can't coerce them. And I mean, beyond just using party voting like a parliament would, there's really no way. Pork is that way. It's that favor. It's that offering. It's that incentive to get people to compromise, to come together, to vote. Yes, it's a form of bribery. Okay? It's a form of bribery, but it's not straight bribery. I'm not actually paying a congressman to get his vote. What I'm doing is I'm giving him something he can give to his people, right, back in his home state or district, in return for his vote. So the pork benefits you and I. And yes, in a roundabout way, benefits the congressman because he can use it in his reelection campaign or whatever. But let's be real. If you get rid of pork, you have to get rid of Congress, because I don't know how else you're going to get these people to come together and agree on anything, right? There's no incentive. There'd be no reason to work together. There'd be no reason to ever give in to the other side ever, or ever care about what anyone else in Congress said. So as much as we bemoan it, pork is, I believe, here to stay, and I believe it's necessary. As your book ended the chapter, the price of a citizen-oriented Congress is a pork-oriented Congress. So cleaning up Congress, I'm not sure how we're going to clean it up and fix it. I don't really know if we can. I don't know if it's as broken as people say it is or act like it is. I think sometimes it gets a bad rap. As I have hinted in here, I do bemoan the fact that I think it's becoming less collegial or less personal. I think it was a bit better that these people had better interpersonal and personal relationships, and that going away might be a problem. I think it opens the door to them being more callous and less formal and appreciative of one another, and I think that could lower the level of discourse and engagement. But in general, I don't think that Congress is quite as broken and failed as some people like to make it out to be. So obviously, like any system, some fixing could be done, but I think the fixes have to come slowly and in baby steps to make sure we don't go too far and make a mistake and take out something that will actually break it.